I checked into a quiet hotel, but the moment she locked the door and said, "You're not leaving yet," everything changed. The taxi dropped me at the hotel just as the sun was dipping low behind the city skyline, casting long, warm streaks of amber across the quiet street. The building itself was unassuming, almost deceptively simple, but the moment I stepped through the glass doors, the atmosphere shifted. The lobby was dimly lit, soft pools of light reflecting off polished wooden floors and bronze fixtures. There was the faint, soothing scent of vanilla and wood polish that seemed to wrap around me like a quiet invitation. I was immediately aware of her presence before I even saw her properly. The hotel manager, a woman in her early 40s, was behind the reception desk, reviewing a clipboard with deliberate calm. She exuded confidence and composure, yet there was a softness to the curve of her smile and a quiet elegance in the way she moved. I couldn't help but notice her posture, straight but relaxed, like she belonged in this space more than anyone else, commanding it without a word. Our eyes met briefly as I approached the desk. There was a pause, subtle but charged, and for a second I felt the strange flutter of curiosity that I hadn't expected. She tilted her head slightly, as if assessing me, her gaze calm but deliberately observant. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured and low, carrying just enough warmth to feel personal without crossing professional boundaries. "Welcome." Checking in. I nodded, fumbling with my wallet slightly. There was something grounding about the way she handed me the key, her fingers brushing mine just long enough for me to notice the warmth of her skin. My chest tightened, a flicker of awareness that this wasn't a casual encounter. I caught myself taking in the details, the faint scent of her perfume, earthy and understated, the subtle glint of silver earrings against her dark hair, the graceful confidence in her posture. She guided me toward the elevators with light touches that seemed incidental but were oddly intimate. Her hand brushed my arm as she handed me a small hotel brochure, and for a fleeting moment, I felt a pulse of something that was more than curiosity. I reminded myself to focus on the task, check in, find the room, settle in. Yet her presence lingered in my mind, an undercurrent of intrigue I couldn't shake. As I rode the elevator, I found myself replaying that first encounter. The way her eyes had briefly softened when she smiled, the ease with which she carried herself, the unspoken suggestion of familiarity in her gestures. Something about her drew me in, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Was it the quiet confidence of someone who had built her life carefully, or was it something more personal, a subtle invitation I wasn't yet ready to interpret? By the time I stepped into the dim hallway leading to my room, a strange mix of anticipation and unease had settled over me. I felt drawn, inexplicably, to her presence even though we had barely spoken. The tension was not alarming but magnetic, like the quiet pull of a current under still water. I didn't know it then, but that first encounter was the thread that would slowly, irrevocably, draw me closer into a story I wasn't ready to leave. A story that began with a locked door and a voice that would forever linger in my thoughts. I had just stepped into my hotel room, the soft click of the door echoing faintly against the thick carpet. The room smelled faintly of linen and warm wood, a calm contrast to the subtle unease building in my chest. I turned to set my bag down when the unexpected happened. The door clicked again, not the usual locking sound for privacy, but a deliberate, assured lock. And then I heard her voice, low, calm, and undeniably in control. "You're not leaving yet." I froze. My first reaction was confusion, tinged with that peculiar thrill of curiosity. She was only a few feet away, leaning slightly against the frame of the door with a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips. Her presence dominated the room without effort. The subtle warmth of her proximity seemed to stretch through the air, wrapping around me like a soft weight I couldn't ignore. She stepped closer to hand me a welcome drink, and the gap between us vanished for a moment. Her fingers brushed mine again, light but deliberate, leaving behind an echo of warmth that made my pulse quicken. I realized I was hyper-aware of every detail. The subtle scent of her perfume, earthy and calming. The soft sweep of her hair brushing her shoulder. The way her eyes held mine for just a fraction longer than polite conversation demanded. "Relax," she said, her voice smooth, almost teasing. "You have time." There was an unspoken layer beneath her words, an invitation that I wasn't sure I was ready to interpret. I moved to the chair by the window, my body still tense from the sudden lock and her controlled approach. She lingered, standing near the door, her posture relaxed yet confident, almost predatory in a way that was utterly non-threatening. The tension between us was palpable, a quiet current running just beneath the surface. My mind raced, trying to rationalize, to find an explanation for why I felt so aware of every subtle movement she made. When she finally set the drink on the table, her hand lingered on mine as she straightened, brushing my knuckles with the back of her fingers. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through me, a grounding connection that felt intimate despite its fleeting nature. I became painfully aware of the age difference. Her quiet assurance and grace contrasted sharply with my own hesitance and restless energy, yet it only drew me closer, compelling my attention in a way I hadn't anticipated. She tilted her head, observing me as I sipped the drink, and I caught the faintest flicker of amusement in her gaze. I wanted to ask why she had locked the door, to challenge the situation, but the way she stood there, composed and unflappable, silenced my words. Her presence had a magnetic quality, not loud or overwhelming, but subtle, insistent, and deeply engaging. In that locked room, I realized something unsettling and thrilling. I was no longer just a guest in this hotel. I was part of her carefully measured space, drawn into a moment neither of us fully explained, yet both of us acknowledged in the unspoken tension between us. My pulse was steady but alert, my mind a mixture of apprehension and fascination, and I couldn't deny that I wanted to see where this strange, intimate pause would lead. After the initial shock of the locked door, the tension in the room didn't dissipate, it transformed. It shifted into something quieter, warmer, and unexpectedly inviting. She poured us each a cup of tea, the steam curling upward and carrying a faint, calming aroma that seemed to anchor the moment. I watched her, noticing how her fingers curved gracefully around the handle, the careful attention she gave each gesture. She set the cup in front of me with a gentle touch, and our hands brushed, just the slightest contact, but enough to send a quiet shiver through my chest. We settled into the small sitting area, facing each other. The room felt intimate, almost cocooned, with the late afternoon light filtering through the curtains and casting soft golden shadows across her face. I was struck by the lines of her smile and the way her eyes crinkled slightly when she laughed. There was a warmth in her presence that was both comforting and disarming. I found myself leaning in slightly, drawn to the subtle gravity she seemed to emit. Our conversation began casually, small talk about the hotel, her work, and the city, but soon it deepened. She shared stories of her past, anecdotes of long nights managing the hotel alone, the quiet moments that no one else noticed. I responded with my own experiences, my words sounding more honest than I had intended. There was a rhythm forming, a give and take that felt effortless. Occasionally, our knees brushed under the small coffee table. Each touch lingered a moment longer than necessary, and I could feel a heat rising in my chest. My eyes caught hers, and for a brief second, we held the look without speaking. In that silence, I felt a connection that was impossible to define, a pull that wasn't purely physical, but emotional, intellectual, and intimate all at once. Her gestures were subtle but telling. When she leaned forward to emphasize a point, her hand lightly touched my forearm. When she laughed at something I said, her shoulder brushed mine. Every movement was intentional, yet casual, a delicate choreography of closeness that neither of us disrupted, but both of us felt acutely. I couldn't ignore the awareness of our age difference. She carried herself with a composure and grace that contrasted sharply with my restless energy. And yet, rather than feeling distant or intimidating, it drew me in, compelling me to pay attention not just to her words but to her presence. I found myself noticing the small things, the curve of her wrist as she gestured, the subtle warmth of her breath as she spoke, the way her eyes softened when she looked at me. By the time the conversation lulled, the room felt charged with unspoken possibilities. There was no need for dramatic declarations or overt gestures. The intimacy was in the shared silences, the light touches, and the steady rhythm of proximity. I realized that something significant had shifted. The simple act of sitting here with her, sharing moments, had created a bond that was quietly, profoundly real. For the first time, I understood that the locked door was not a trap, but an opening, an invitation to step closer, emotionally and physically, into a space that neither of us could quite name, but both of us were drawn to explore. The room had quieted, the soft hum of the city outside barely reaching us through the thick windows. There was a pause between our conversation, a moment of stillness that felt different from before. She leaned back in her chair, her hands folded in her lap, eyes tracing the patterns of sunlight on the carpet. There was a softness in her posture, a subtle tension in her shoulders that I hadn't noticed before. I realized she was allowing herself to be vulnerable, and it drew my attention in a way that was almost magnetic. She began speaking slowly, hesitantly at first, about the pressures of managing the hotel, the long nights spent alone making decisions that affected everyone around her. Her voice was measured but carried a quiet undercurrent of weariness, the kind that comes from years of responsibility and self-reliance. She spoke of the loneliness that often accompanies independence, not desperation, but a gentle ache that only someone truly attentive could notice. I felt an urge to respond carefully, to listen more than speak. I wanted to offer some small comfort without overstepping, to convey understanding without intruding. As she talked, her hand brushed against mine lightly when she gestured, and I felt the warmth of her skin under my fingertips. The simple touch was grounding, connecting us in a way that words alone couldn't. I noticed her pulse quicken subtly with each pause, her vulnerability made more tangible by the faint tremor of her hands. She laughed softly at one point, almost apologetically, as if embarrassed by the admission of her own fears. I leaned in slightly, drawn by the honesty in her expression, and offered a quiet, sincere comment, acknowledging that such feelings were human, natural, and not a weakness. The way her eyes softened at my words, the gentle exhale she let slip, made the room feel smaller, more intimate, a private world suspended between us. The sunlight shifted, casting a warm glow over her face, highlighting the fine lines of her smile, the gentle curve of her cheek. I became acutely aware of the subtle scent of her perfume, warm and earthy, mingling with the faint aroma of tea. Every detail, the tilt of her head, the way she avoided my gaze then returned it deliberately, the delicate curve of her lips, seemed magnified, making the moment feel heavier with meaning. I realized then that our connection had deepened beyond playful intrigue. It had moved into a space of trust, of genuine emotional intimacy. I wanted to reassure her, to let her know that her openness was received with care, that the space we shared was safe for moments like this. I placed my hand lightly near hers, not touching yet, but close enough for her to feel the intention, the steady presence of someone fully attentive. By the time our conversation wound down, a new understanding had settled between us. The age difference, the professional boundaries, all of it seemed secondary to the quiet bond forming, fragile, tender, and profoundly human. In that room, vulnerability had become the bridge connecting us, and I found myself more drawn to her than ever, curious to explore the depths that lay just beneath the surface. By the time evening settled fully, the room had taken on a warm, intimate glow. The city lights outside were soft and distant, leaving only the muted amber of the lamps to illuminate the space. I was acutely aware of her presence, the way she moved, the way her gaze found mine even in silence, the subtle shifts in her posture that suggested she, too, felt the growing tension between us. We had drifted into quiet conversation, but the words felt secondary to the unspoken currents in the room. She adjusted the curtains to let a sliver of light through, and our hands brushed lightly as we both reached for the same fold of fabric. The brief contact sent a ripple of warmth through me, a reminder of how aware I was of her closeness, her subtle yet magnetic presence. I caught myself lingering on these small interactions, noticing the curve of her wrist, the gentle tilt of her head, the way her eyes seemed to study me with careful curiosity. At one point, she moved to pour another cup of tea. As she leaned closer, her shoulder brushed mine ever so slightly. It was a fleeting, almost accidental contact, but the effect was immediate. My chest tightened, a quiet, steady reminder that there was something unspoken hovering between us. She didn't comment, didn't acknowledge it overtly, yet the silence that followed felt full, charged with an understanding that neither of us had to speak aloud. Our knees brushed again as we sat down, closer now, naturally adjusting to the small confines of the room. I became conscious of every subtle detail. The soft rustle of her clothing as she shifted, the warmth radiating from her body, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the tea. My mind was aware of the age gap, the professional boundaries, yet none of it lessened the pull I felt. If anything, it made every gesture, every fleeting touch, more potent. She caught me looking at her and tilted her head with a small, knowing smile. There was no need for words. Her expression said what our voices could not yet. In that moment, the distance between us felt simultaneously vast and negligible, a paradox of longing and hesitation. I noticed how her eyes softened when she smiled, how her lips barely parted as if holding back something unspoken. Even the silences carried meaning. When she paused mid-sentence to glance out the window, the way she rested her hand lightly on the arm of my chair, I felt the tension coil tighter, not as anxiety, but as anticipation. There was a rhythm forming between us, unspoken but undeniable, a careful dance of proximity, glances, and subtle touches. By the end of the evening, I understood that this night, locked doors, shared tea, soft glances, had changed something fundamental between us. The attraction was no longer tentative curiosity. It was quiet, steady, and deeply magnetic. Every gesture, every subtle brush of skin, every lingering look, had built an invisible bridge between us, and I could feel that both of us were aware of the connection growing stronger, yet neither of us ready to cross it entirely. Not yet. The room felt suspended in a quiet stillness, as if the world outside had softened, leaving only the two of us in a space that existed apart from time. The muted glow of the lamps highlighted her features, the gentle curve of her jaw, the subtle warmth in her eyes, the delicate arch of her brow. I found myself watching her with a mix of fascination and cautious vulnerability, aware that what I felt went beyond casual admiration. She spoke softly, her voice carrying a weight I hadn't noticed before, a mixture of restraint and openness that drew me in. There was a pause in her words, a subtle hesitation, and in that silence, I sensed the vulnerability she had shown earlier had deepened. It wasn't just the loneliness of managing the hotel or the quiet pressures of her life. It was something more intimate, more personal. I leaned forward slightly, my hands resting on my knees, trying to convey both attentiveness and steadiness. I wanted her to know that I was present, that I understood, that I wasn't here to judge or rush. I admire you, I admitted, my voice quieter than I expected, almost swallowed by the room's calm. Not just for what you do, but for who you are, for how you carry everything. Her gaze softened, and I noticed the faintest quiver in her lips, a subtle sign of emotion restrained but palpable. She moved slightly closer, her hand hovering near mine before brushing lightly against my cheek. The touch was feather-light, yet it sent a warmth through me that was both grounding and electrifying. Her skin was warm under my fingers, and the gesture carried a quiet reassurance, a gentle acknowledgement that she felt the same pull I did. We sat like that for a moment, the distance between us shrinking not through words, but through the unspoken understanding in our shared glances, the subtle brush of hands, the slight tilt of her head, as if inviting me to close the gap. Every heartbeat felt louder, more intentional, each second stretching with the weight of possibilities we both sensed, but neither fully voiced. I wasn't sure if I should, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, but I'm glad you said it. Her hand lingered near mine, brushing against my arm, tracing a careful path as if exploring the connection we had built. I felt her steadiness, her confidence, and her restraint all at once, and it made me want to meet her halfway, to offer my own quiet certainty. I reached out slowly, letting my hand hover until our fingers intertwined, a delicate, deliberate gesture. It wasn't a leap, but a bridge, a tangible expression of the trust and affection that had grown between us. The warmth of her hand against mine, the softness of her gaze, the subtle incline of her head toward me, all combined into a moment that felt suspended, intimate, and profoundly human. In that room, with the city quiet beyond the windows, I realized that the tension, the locked door, the cautious gestures had led to this. A mutual recognition of feelings, a shared admission of desire tempered by respect, and a connection that was as emotional as it was gentle. For the first time, the age gap and the unusual circumstances felt irrelevant, eclipsed by the quiet certainty of what existed between us. Morning arrived quietly, sunlight spilling through the curtains in soft, golden rays that painted the room in warmth. The city outside was waking slowly, but inside, time felt suspended, as if the night's intimacy had created a bubble around us that neither of us was eager to break. I stirred, realizing how profoundly the events of the night had settled into me. The locked door, the tea, the soft glances, the subtle touches. All of it had woven a thread between us that felt delicate yet unbreakable. She moved across the room to pour coffee, and as she handed me the cup, our fingers brushed again. The contact was light, almost casual, yet charged with the quiet understanding of what had passed between us. I noticed the faint warmth of her hand against mine, the gentle exhale that accompanied her movement, and the way her eyes met mine briefly before she looked away, as if savoring a private moment. We sat together at the small table, the morning light illuminating the subtle lines of her face and the calm confidence in her posture. There was no need for grand declarations. Our connection was already expressed in the lingering touches, the steadying presence beside one another, and the silent acknowledgement of mutual feelings. She smiled at something I said, a soft, knowing smile that made my chest tighten in a pleasant, anticipatory way. At one point, her hand rested lightly on the back of my chair, the warmth and weight of her touch grounding me. I caught myself leaning just slightly closer, drawn to her in a way that felt natural, comfortable, and profoundly intimate. Our proximity carried a quiet promise, a sense that while this morning might end, the connection we had built would endure beyond the room, beyond the hotel walls. I stood to leave, my bag in hand, feeling a subtle hesitation I hadn't anticipated. She approached the door with me, her presence calm but intentional. Our hands brushed lightly as I adjusted my jacket, and she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement that words weren't necessary. That one fleeting gesture, that small touch, carried more meaning than any conversation could have conveyed. As I walked down the hallway toward the lobby, I glanced back. She was watching, her posture relaxed, her expression composed, yet carrying a quiet warmth that stayed with me long after I left the room. The image of her lingered in my mind, her hair catching the morning light, the gentle curve of her lips in a private smile, the calm steadiness in her eyes. I stepped into the hotel's front doors, the city now fully awake around me, and felt an unexpected sense of clarity. The night had changed something, subtly, profoundly. I had been drawn into her world, into her presence, and though the door had opened again, the bond remained. The quiet touches, the shared silences, the mutual understanding, they had left an indelible mark. Even as I walked away, I knew this was more than a fleeting encounter. It was a connection that would echo in my mind, in the small ways I noticed the world, in the way I remembered warmth, presence, and intimacy without urgency. The hotel, the locked door, the night together, all of it had transformed a simple stay into a memory that would linger, gentle but unshakable, a testament to a slow, deliberate, deeply human connection that neither time nor distance could diminish.